It is the most populous country in the world with one of the largest economies. But China isn't growing the way it once did, and its population is forecast to start shrinking. Meanwhile, its neighbor India has a booming economy and a young and growing population. What does all this mean for China, India, and the world economy? Well, joining us now to consider that, from Waterloo, Ontario, Honying Wang. She is Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And Professor, we're delighted to welcome you to TVO tonight. We're going to put up a map of China just so everybody can see the part of the world that we're talking about. China, with its number one sized population in the world and some of its major urban centers. But let's look at the facts a little more deeply. That population of 1.37 billion people produces an economy which is huge, $11.83 trillion annually, but the growth rate, 6.8%, considerably below what it has been for many, many years, and a population rate below the poverty line, China says, of 6.1%. And Professor, that's where I want to start. Those are the numbers that we're told. How reliable do you think they are?
I think the statistics about population under poverty line is up for interpretation, primarily because every country could use a different criterion. So in the case of China, if we consider poverty line to be around $1, then China has $1 a day, then China has about 82 million people living under that line. But if you consider the reality, $1 isn't really sufficient to cover life's basics. So more likely it should be $2 per day. And considering all the other vulnerabilities, the latest figure I have seen from the Asian Development Bank is actually 300 million. So that's more than 3 times the official estimate. So it is really somewhat arbitrary depending on where you draw the line.
It was one of the things that sort of got my antennae up, because I think in this country, in Canada, our governments say that the number of people living under the poverty line is almost 10%. And it's hard to imagine that China is, that the least fortunate in China are doing better than us. So I'm right to be suspicious of that number then.
Yeah, well, that's the arbitrary nature of that.
Exactly. The growth rate it's the lowest right now, perhaps in the last quarter century, after decades and decades of growth. To what do you attribute the declining growth rate?
Well, I think in considering that, we need to think about both broader forces and more specific factors. So let me start with the broader forces. So for the first 3 decades of China's reform, which began in the late 70s, a couple of major changes happened. One was the movement of people from agrarian China to cities, coastal places where they became industrial workers. And that's a one-time transfer of labor force to a much more productive sector of the economy. Secondly, from Maoist China, where people had hardly any material incentives to work very hard, the Chinese government introduced market mechanisms which brought in incentives that had not been there before. So that greatly increased the productivity of people. And those 2 factors have more or less exhausted their utility by now. So those are the broader issues. Secondly, very specific factors are at work as well. So as you mentioned before, China had a population dividend which is now disappearing. That population dividend enabled China to produce for the world effectively, efficiently, cheap industrial products. And also investment was for many years the driving force for China in manufacturing, infrastructure, and so on. Again, that force is reaching its limitation at the present. So issues having to do with exports, including cheap labor, lower exchange rate, having run their course, and investment returns being lower and lower are 2 very specific reasons why we're seeing a slower growth of the Chinese economy.
Let me follow up on the notion of transition. You talked about the transition the country made from agrarian to a more industrialized, more urbanized society. What transition do you think China, economically speaking, is undergoing today?
Actually, that's a very good start. Urbanization is one transition. In addition, China is also trying to make the transition to a domestic consumption-based economy rather than being too dependent on exports and investment. In addition, China is making much more successfully the transition from manufacturing to service as a major part of the economy. So those are, I guess, at least three transitions.
Sure. I guess the sort of $64,000 question is: Does the political structure, the political institutions of China, are they are they appropriate to supporting the kind of transitions you've just talked about?
I think that's a very tough question that the Chinese government itself recognizes. The political structure has, for many years, encouraged the allocation of resources favoring state-owned sector, and that continues today. One of the biggest challenge for China now is a much better, more efficient financial system that would allocate financial resources more in the direction of the most dynamic sector. Those are the private-owned enterprises, so that the economy could grow faster. So as of now, the state orientation of the financial system is encouraging zombie enterprises owned by the state to stay open, whereas the more dynamic and innovative enterprises in the private sector are deprived of financing. So that's a real problem. The other issue having to do with the political system is innovation. The Chinese government has been saying for the last few years, the next step in China's economic development is no longer going to be the cheap and low-end manufacturing. It has to come from innovation. But that means a much more liberal and open kind of system, both politically and otherwise.
And one quick follow-up on a term you just used that I'm not sure everybody knows what it means. Zombie? What did you refer to?
The zombie enterprises.
Zombie
Those are
enterprises.
enterprises that have been losing money, are just basically on life support because of government-directed lending.
There's, of course, a great deal of focus around the world today on the two countries that have 1 billion people in them, China being one, India being the other. At the moment, well, I should ask you, certainly much of what I hear suggests that the future belongs more to India than to China. If China does have any advantages over India, what would you say they are?
Well, I think India's advantage and its disadvantage is probably the same thing, which is its political system. In the long run, people have different opinions. Some theorists have said democracies ultimately will grow faster, even though they may be slower in the short term. When you have free thinking, free press, and free entrepreneurship, I think that sounds quite promising in the long run. But in the short run, China's one-party political system has done things very effectively and efficiently. It doesn't have to consult everybody and wait for years for an infrastructure project to be finished. I think in the long run, there's something to be said about India's dynamism, and not to mention its population dividend. India's population is going to peak in 2060 with 1.7 billion people, and China's is going to peak in the next 10 years or so, peaking at 1.4 billion. So ultimately, the labor force, the consumers, and so on are, of course, factors all favoring India.
Just explain a little more, if you could. China's declining population, not today, but not so far down the road. Mm-hmm. What kind of negative impact do you see that having on the country's economic future?
Well, I think it's the size of the market, the size of the labor force. So it's not only that the population is going to shrink, it also is that the age structure of the population is becoming less and less favorable for China. So today, I think China's median age is about 38. India's is 28. So we're talking about both the size and the structure, which affects the labor force as well as the consumer market.
Do you find it somewhat ironic that China finds itself in this position, given how explosive its population growth had been over the previous 25, 50 years?
Well, China's population growth gradually declined beginning in the 1970s. But with the one-child policy, that decline has accelerated, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it is now the population growing at 0.5%, as opposed to even in the 1990s, it was 1.4 or 5%, and India's is about 1.2%. So China's decline of population growth is something of pretty recent vintage, and it is unfortunately a problem the government has come to recognize and begun to deal with too late. From the long-term, health of the Chinese economy's point of view.
Let me ask you more about that, because this will not be any surprise to people who, for example, who grew up in the province of Quebec, where the government, for years and years, has tried to incentivize people to have more children. But I'm hearing now that China may actually be doing this as well. Government incentives for people to have more kids. Are you hearing that?
Well, what we're hearing now, we know for sure, is that the Chinese government has ended its one-child only per family policy. And so in theory, every family now has the right and even is encouraged to have 2 children. I haven't heard subsidies yet, but that is not out of the question. The problem, as you know from Quebec, Singapore, and other countries, is that people now have gotten into this new mindset that they don't necessarily want more than 1 child. So I think even last year, the quota for families to have 2 children was far from fully used. So I think the trend is unfortunately not in the right direction as far as the population issue is concerned.
And I presume China is not much of a net recipient for immigration. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's not.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you a very open-ended question here as we think about the China of today compared to, say, 20 years ago. If I were to ask you to compare those 2 different Chinas, what are sort of the immediate reactions that you would have in terms of the biggest differences between the 2?
Well, we can begin with the size of the economy, because that's what people seem to be most impressed with. So 20 years ago, China's economy was smaller than the economy of the UK, of Germany, of Italy, of France. Today, China's economy is just about the same as the US, depending on how you calculate the GDP size. And so China has become, in 20 years, from one of the major economies to a top economy in the world. So that's a very big difference. Secondly, China's middle class has grown tremendously. So in the 1990s, there were certain clusters in urban China who were perhaps able to afford things beyond life's basics, but now that portion of the society has become much bigger. And the consumption, even with the slower economy in China, is really impressive. I mean, many multinational corporations are eyeing China as a consumer market, even with the 6% growth rate. So that's something you wouldn't have foreseen perhaps 20 years ago.
And yet, I'm going to follow up on this again, with all of the cataclysmic changes we've seen in China, from agrarian to more industrial and more urbanized society, with the rise of a consumer class there, with the rise of a middle class there, with the enormous growth rates the country has enjoyed over the last many years. In spite of all that, it's still a one-party state. We haven't seen much change at all on that front. Do you think we will?
I think that's a very tough question. In theory, again, you would expect, as the size of the middle class grows, as the living standard of the population grows, people would be, more demanding and more capable of democratic governance. But in China, this has been probably a rather unique case of a party that has so far had the good fortune, and probably due to capability as well, of running a very successful economy such that the legitimacy of the party is perhaps more solid than one would have expected, after all these years of a one-party system. So I personally think for as long as the economy does reasonably well, the one-party system is likely to persist, despite all the other problems.
Okay, Professor, just finally, you're on TVO, so we're going to ask a question about how China affects the O in TVO. The changes to China's economy, what impact do you think they have here on the province of Ontario?
Well, with the economic slowdown in China, it has various implications for different sectors. So it's hard to generalize for a geographic region, but I would say for energy-based economy, it's not good news because China's manufacturing decline would mean less demand for these kinds of products and lower prices for these kinds of commodities and energy products. On the other hand, because China now is turning toward a more domestic consumption-based economic model, it is more able to import necessities, for example, agricultural products from other countries in Canada, and I assume Ontario as well has a great opportunity there.
Understood. Hongying Wang from CG and the University of Waterloo, it's awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.
The United Nations predicts that as soon as the year 2022, India will surpass China as the world's most populous nation. By some accounts, India has already overtaken China in economic growth. To explore what that means for India's economic future, its relationship with Canada, and its place in the world economy, we're joined by Partha Mohanram. He is director of the India Innovation Institute at the Rotman School of Management at U of T. And Partha, it's good to have you back here. It's been a few years.
It's been 4 years and it's wonderful to be back.
But who's counting?
Not me.
Not you. Okay, good. Let's just put some facts up on India before we start our conversation, which will help bring people up to speed on where things are at. India's population, 1.25 billion people, with a GDP almost the same size as Canada's, $2.183 trillion. A growth rate, however, much north of Canada's at 7.3%. These are all estimates from the CIA World Factbook, so I want to start there. How accurate do you think those numbers really are?
I think those numbers are reasonably accurate. So these are not like numbers coming from like a government statistician and stuff. So I think those numbers do have some credibility. The one thing which must be mentioned is when you're talking about countries like India, it's probably more useful to look at PPP GDP numbers, purchasing power parity adjusted. So if you look at PPP numbers, for example, India is by all accounts the third biggest economy in the world. So traditional GDP numbers understate the size of the economies of countries like India and China and others, right? If you look at per capita numbers, the PPP per capita numbers for India are something like $6,500 a year per capita, as opposed to under 2,000 in like nominal GDP terms.
Understood.
So I think the numbers are reasonably accurate, though.
You know, we get very excited in this country if our growth rate hits 2.5% or even 2%. And India is now looking at growth rates north of 7%. And of course, one of the big questions is, can that persist? What do you think?
So certainly, firstly, it's well known that if your base is lower, and certainly India's base is pretty low, you have much more opportunities for growth. So those numbers are kind of natural. So it's natural to expect a country like India and China and some of the other developing countries to go at much faster rates because there's so much more to grow. Now, as far as whether that's sustainable, I think it has to be sustainable because a country like India, which is a young country getting younger, which is adding more and more people to the workforce on a annual basis, needs the growth. It needs the growth so that it can create employment opportunities for all these young people who are entering the workforce on an annual basis.
When you say it needs it, that doesn't mean it's going to get it.
I agree. So, but I think a combination of good economic policies and to some extent good fortune can certainly help India. So I'll give you an example of a couple of those. So for example, India is one of the few countries, in Canada we felt the pain of low oil prices, right? So with the Canadian dollar declining from above parity to as low as 69 cents and all the issues going on in the Alberta and the western part of the country. India is a huge importer of oil. And India has seen its oil bill fall drastically. It's actually allowed the government, for example, to cut subsidies on petroleum products without necessarily passing on the pain to the customer. So in some sense, it's allowed them to make a good and politically difficult decision, which is going to help them in the future, right? So that's an example of sort of macroeconomic luck from India's perspective. But there have also been some good policies taken not just by the current government, but by a succession of governments. So, for instance, India very recently passed a bankruptcy bill. So, one of the big issues in India is the large percentage of non-performing loans and the unwillingness of, let's say, people to lend money simply because of fear that they're not going to get their money back. And one of the reasons why this is because India has not had a proper bankruptcy law in place. So the passage of the new bankruptcy law should encourage lending, which should encourage investment and therefore help the growth be maintained at these levels.
Let's talk poverty, though. India's poverty rate has declined a lot over the last 25 years. But even if it is, you tell me, is it 15, 20% of the population, something like that?
Those are numbers I have seen.
Okay, so even if it's 15 to 20% of the population, we are talking still
Absolutely.
200 million people, as a conservative estimate, still living in real dire poverty. I mean, that's very sobering, isn't it?
It is. But I would encourage all the viewers of TVO, when you look at a country like India or, for instance, China, right, to have a long-term, what I call a time series approach and not a cross-sectional approach. Without getting technical, what it means is don't compare these countries to what USA and Canada look like today. Mm-hmm. Think about the sort of larger lens of history. Think about what, let's say, these countries would have looked like in the late 19th century with all the immigrants coming in and the tenements and so on and so forth, right? From that, you had tremendous growth which led to prosperity and opportunity, which led to the countries being what they are right now. So I think the same is probably true for India. So the same numbers, it would have been 40%, maybe less than 2 decades ago. It's like a halving of the poverty rate, right? So there's tremendous work to be done. 20% of 1.25 billion is a big number. Like you pointed out, it's like the size, almost the size of the United States, 8 times the size of Canada. But that number is declining. And increasingly, people are seeing fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, and that's encouraging investments. So you have this sort of transformational leapfrogging going on in India, where the application of technology by both the public and private sectors is helping the people at the bottom of the pyramid in many ways.
But if it took 2 decades to cut the poverty rate in half, and that is a tremendous accomplishment, let's not put our noses up at that. Do you think it'll take another 20 years to have the poverty rate again?
It'll probably take more, because I don't think poverty is going to be eliminated, and it gets more and more difficult to get to the sort of underlying roots of poverty, because there are some issues in India. Some of them are social, some of them are historical, and so on and so forth. But you cannot deny the tremendous accomplishments which have taken place and are continuing to take place. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So for example, the previous government started this very ambitious project called the Aadhaar project, or the UID project. It's trying to get every Indian a biometric ID. And if you just think about, you've seen India, you've seen the poverty, every single person should get an ID. And they started the project like 6 or 7 years ago under the previous Congress government. And the current BJP government was under tremendous pressure to cancel this project simply because it was the project of the previous government. So to their credit, they decided not to do that and continue with the implementation of the project. So this project is not without flaws. The fact is, as of like April of this year, 1 billion Indians have a unique ID. What this means is governments can work on things like transfers, trying to get people bank accounts, things that, in a sense, e-governance, things that can reduce corruption, reduce leakages.
They can plan.
They can plan. They know exactly what the people are, what their needs are, and so on and so forth. So to answer your original question about can poverty be eliminated, the answer is it's going to be incredibly difficult. But when you have high growth, and certainly the benefits are going to accrue disproportionately to the wealthy, but there's enough in that growth for everyone to benefit.
Let me ask a question that sort of looks at this from maybe, as they say, 35,000 feet up in the air. Turn of the century, there was a lot of talk about how the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, were going to take the world by storm. Their growth rates were up, and they were going to be showing us all how to do it. Well, not quite, right? I mean, Brazil is in a political mess right now. Their economy is tanking as well. Russia, we could go on for an hour about how bad Russia's doing right now. China, not much more political freedom, and growth rates have significantly gone down. And there's India really doing the best of all the BRIC countries. How come?
See, I'm going to go back to one of my earlier appearances on this show 4 years ago where I used two terms, right? Two words, the two demos, democracy and demographics. Both of them will always be in India's favor because, you can talk about should we democratize first or should we grow first, and China has taken the let's grow first model, but that has its limitations. You've seen the problems going on with, what's happening in Hong Kong, and, it's spilling over to parts of China and stuff. But the biggest advantage for India is demographics. I think if I have my facts correct, the average Indian is 24, the average Chinese person is almost 40, and the average Indian is getting younger. The average Chinese person is getting older. And the sort of flip side of the one-child policy is China has a very skewed dependency ratio and like an inverted pyramid, which is going to cause like problems, with growing healthcare costs and reducing labor force participation as time goes by.
And many more men than women.
Absolutely. So that's a problem India has as well, and there's a whole new show on that, but whole different show on that. But having said that, India has a young population, a growing population, and that has its challenges as well because you need to create employment for all these people entering the workforce. So in some sense, that's why India has to grow.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. India, I gather the estimates are by the year 2022 is going to be the most populous country in the whole world,
right,
going ahead of China. What's the upside? I can see the downside, having to create jobs for all of those new people. What's the upside?
See, for me, whether India is 1.28 and China is 1.26 is irrelevant. Can India sustain itself at its current population levels? One thing across history which has taken place is that, in general, Malthusian predictions about populations have not worked out simply because people have not taken into account the fact that there are improvements in technology and productivity and so on and so forth. India, even though its population is growing, its growth rate is declining quite sharply. And people have looked at the growth rate is declining with increases in literacy, with improvements in female empowerment and so on and so forth. And it's happening throughout the country, including the sort of most backward parts of the country. So I think even though India's population is increasing, it's not increasing at an alarming rate, it's increasing at a declining rate. And clearly there are problems, pressures on land. India, if you've looked at a map, India is the 7th largest country in the world, but it's significantly smaller than, it's 1/3 the size of, let's say, China, Canada, or the US in terms of geography, right? The good news is almost all of India is arable, unlike some of the other countries. But the fact is you still have to feed and employ 1.2, 1.3 billion people, so that will always be a challenge. But I firmly believe that, this is a challenge India and Indians can face. The one last thing I will say is, the West has traditionally looked at India versus China. I think the most interesting thing going on right now is India and China. So one of the largest investors in India is China. So if you look at all the very large Chinese e-commerce players, they're all in India right now because the Chinese market has it's getting close to saturated, and they're seeing the big opportunities in India because some of the same technological issues, like, for example, people said e-commerce would never take off in India and China because you can't have like banking and credit cards and stuff. And the Chinese people, Alibaba and all, have shown that you don't need that. They've come up with Alipay. So Alibaba is a big investor in some of the similar companies in India. So for example, you have companies like Paytm and Freecharge in India, which have completely revolutionizing e-commerce in India. So I think that's the big frontier. All these factors, right, are going to help. It's going to help government. It's going to help people at all levels of society because essentially it's going to unleash efficiencies and productivity, which is going to only help the country.
Let's, in our last couple of minutes here, talk about your mandate at the India Innovation Institute at Rotman. What do you do?
So this is an institute which is, it's actually just located at Rotman. I must mention this is a U of T initiative. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to get the best minds and resources at U of T and indeed elsewhere to essentially try to highlight issues related to innovation and India. And it doesn't necessarily have to be one way. But it could be what ideas can a developed nation like Canada help? What can they provide to help a country like India, which clearly needs ideas to sustain its growth and so on and so forth? But it could easily be the other way around as well. There's lots going on in countries like India where people are doing innovation with very limited resources. And one of the things, living in a city like Toronto and stuff, we know that governments are very often resource constrained. So how can you be more efficient in the use of resources, right? So what we want to do in this institute is essentially get talks, discussions, get research on the word innovation in India defined very broadly. So what can developing countries learn, like India, learn from the West to innovate more successfully? And what can the West learn from countries like India or South Asia broadly on how to innovate frugally? So, for example, we're trying to get prominent people to come and give talks. We're hoping to have the current RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan to potentially come and talk to us about. He's been one of the people who has been shepherding the Indian economy, which, by the way, has seen reduction in inflation rates and reasonably good macroeconomic performance while the world's economy has sort of been going through a lot of uncertainty. But I also am interested in trying to, for instance, get a student-run conference where the students would try to invite speakers and try to get panelists to get different topics discussed on, what's going on, what's innovative, what's going on in countries like India, what can Canada learn from it, and certainly, what can India learn from the experiences of the West as it tries to grow itself for the future.
Let me ask you one last question, and it's a bit of an offbeat question, but I asked the New York Times reporter Anand Girdhar asked this question once, and it was, where are you from originally?
I'm from you mean where in India?
Yeah.
I find that question extremely hard to answer. Let me explain to you why. So I'm ethnically South Indian, but I grew up most of my life in the North. So I grew up in Delhi and Bombay, but I'm Tamilian, so I'm from Chennai, but and my parents now live in Bangalore, and so I have allegiances to 5 or 6 different Indian cities. So
Okay. Well, the question still works, which is there a part of you that feels the heartstrings tugging to go back and to apply your talents there to improve the country there?
That's an excellent question. And I think certainly that's a factor which comes up, not just from a talent perspective. As your parents get older, you feel as though, should I be here or should I be back in India where your parents live, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the things that the Indian diaspora has been very successful, in Canada, in the US and elsewhere, is they've been tremendous resources for the country. Right. So in terms of, if you look at Silicon Valley and innovation, there's a very strong Indian component in it. But some of it's also gone back to India in terms of investments, in terms of the location of many of their operations in India. So it's had tremendous benefits for India. So in my case as an academic, while I am based here in Canada and I was in the US before, I do spend a fair amount of time in India. So I was in India just recently. At the Indian School of Business, and similarly when I'm in India I try to take part in conferences and seminars and stuff. So I do kind of try to maintain this bicontinental existence.
And why, just finally, do you think Ontarians ought to care about what's going on in India?
So I think Ontarians specifically and Canadians in general should care about India for a number of reasons. So I have this view that if you think about, let's just take about Canada, the US, right? India and China, you ask the average Ontarian or the average Canadian what's going on in Asia. For them, Asia is China, right? And you ask the average Indian what's going on in the West, it's the US, right? I want to kind of shift the attention of the average Indian a bit to the north. And I want to sort of change the attention of the average Ontarian or Canadian a bit to the south. Because there's a lot going on between India and Canada and Ontario in specific. So we have a shared history. We have a very similar system. I mean, we are both like former British colonies. We have a very similar system of government, sort of the Westminster parliamentary democracy. English is the language of business in India. So India follows a common law, Anglo-Saxon common law system. Flawed as it might be, but the system of courts and stuff are still very similar. The Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, had a very successful visit to India just a few months ago, where she met the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, a couple of times. She met the leading industrialists, like the head of the Tata Group in India, and so on and so forth. It's pretty amazing because she was, for a subnational leader, to get that level of access. So clearly there's a lot of interest in India as well.
We should say, in the interest of equal time, Patrick Brown, the Conservative Party leader, considers Mr. Modi one of his best friends, and they've met a dozen times.
So the thing is that the relationship with India has nothing to do with political affiliation. I think it's very important for Canadians to just see it as an opportunity, right? So, and Canada can contribute a lot, and Ontario as well. So for example, we have tremendous education institutions in India, and the big growth is happening in education in India. India is also seeing a revolution in things like energy, especially renewable energy, and certainly that's an area where Canada and Ontario can provide lots of expertise. And so I think, and the last thing is, if you've just seen the changing demographics of Ontario, there's a very large diasporic presence here of South Asian diaspora. So I think they can serve as the link between these two countries, and I think that's why the prospects of sort of partnership between India and Ontario are very bright in my opinion.
Terrific. Good to see you again.
Nice to be back.
Thank you for this. Partha Mohan Ram, Professor of Financial Accounting and the Director of the India Innovation Institute at the Rotman School of Management, U of T.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.